The 27th of July, 2002, began with a deceptive, heavy stillness. At the Sknyliv airfield in Ukraine, the summer sun was a physical weight, baking the concrete until the horizon began to blur and warp. If you were standing there in that crowd of 50,000 people, the first thing you would have noticed wasn't the sight of planes, but the smell. It was a suffocating mix of hot tarmac, cheap festival food, and the sharp, chemical tang of unburnt jet fuel hanging in the stagnant air. Families stood shoulder to shoulder, squinting into a sky so blue it looked glass shards sharp. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, clutching ice creams that melted faster than they could eat them. There was a low, constant hum, the sound of 50,000 voices laughing, whispering, and waiting. They were all looking up, searching for a speck of silver in the haze. They had no way of knowing that the very air they were breathing was about to be ignited. They didn't know that the shadow currently racing toward them across the grass wasn't just a plane, it was a 16-ton kinetic hammer. This was the last moment of peace Sknyliv would ever know. Within minutes, the sound of laughter would be permanently replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped breathing. To understand why these 50,000 people were standing in the path of a disaster, you have to understand the pride of a young nation. This wasn't just an air show. It was the 60th anniversary of the 14th Air Corps. Ukraine was a country trying to prove that even though the Soviet Union had collapsed, its teeth were still sharp. The Ukrainian Falcons were the pilots chosen to prove it. They were viewed as more than just men. They were the masters of gravity, the elite few who could tame the most dangerous machines ever built. The crowd trusted them with a blind, terrifying intensity. This is what we call the hubris of the spectacle. The organizers wanted to give the people a thrill, so they did something fatal. They moved the flight line. They allowed the jets to perform maneuvers directly over the heads of the spectators, ignoring the basic laws of safety that dictate a buffer zone between a screaming jet and a human skull. They believed their pilots were too good to fail. They believed the machine was too perfect to fall. They invited 50,000 people to stand on a metaphorical landmine, convinced that as long as the music played, it would never go off. It was a gamble made by men in medals, played out with the lives of families who just wanted to see something beautiful. The machine they came to see was the Sukhoi Su-27, a beast of titanium and aluminum known to the West as the Flanker. It is a beautiful, brutalist piece of engineering. It doesn't just fly. It brute forces its way through the atmosphere using two Lyulka L-31F engines. Each of these engines produces over 27,000 pounds of thrust. To put that in perspective, the Su-27 has enough power to climb straight up, accelerating toward the stars like a rocket. It was designed to be the ultimate predator of the Cold War. But on this specific day, the Flanker with serial number 96,310,424,040 was hiding a deadly secret. It was heavy, excessively, dangerously heavy. The plane had been filled with a maximum load of fuel for a flight that had been canceled earlier that morning. Instead of draining the tanks, the crew left the fuel inside. This meant that when the pilots pulled the stick back to perform their acrobatic stunts, they weren't flying the agile fighter they were used to. They were fighting 28 tons of dead weight. In the cockpit, every degree of a turn and every foot of altitude is a calculation of physics. But when you add thousands of pounds of extra fuel, those calculations break. The wings, though massive, can only provide so much lift before the air gives up and the plane stalls. The Su-27 is a masterpiece of engineering, but even a masterpiece has a breaking point. As it turned toward the crowd, the plane wasn't failing, it was simply following the cold, hard laws of physics. It was too heavy, it was too low, and it was running out of sky. The transition from a high-speed performance to a low-altitude disaster is often a quiet one. It doesn't start with an explosion. It starts with a loss of energy. At exactly 12:43 p.m., the Su-27UB, piloted by Volodymyr Toponer and Yuri Yegorov, rolled into a descending maneuver known as a downward spiral. In a standard flight configuration, this is a routine display of the aircraft's ability to change direction while shedding altitude. But as the nose of the flanker dipped toward the horizon, the physics of the day began to change the math. The air over Sknyliv was hot, nearly 30 degrees Celsius. In aviation, hot air is thin air. It provides less lift for the wings and less oxygen for the engines. When you combine this thin air with the massive, uncalculated weight of the extra fuel in the tanks, the Su-27 stopped behaving like a fighter jet and started behaving like a heavy transport. As the pilots pulled the nose through the bottom of the roll, they expected the plane to bite into the air and climb. Instead, the plane slid. You can see it in the archival footage the moment the pilots realize they are falling through their safety floor. The engines scream, the afterburners kick in, dumping raw fuel into the exhaust to create a massive pillar of fire. But it's too late. The plane had already gathered too much downward momentum. Imagine trying to stop a freight train in the length of a driveway. But as the plane fell, the most haunting link in that chain was formed on the ground. It's called normalcy bias. It is a psychological phenomenon where the human brain refuses to accept that a catastrophe is happening right in front of it. We are hardwired to believe that things like this don't happen here. For the people standing on the tarmac, their brains were processing conflicting information. On one hand, their eyes saw a massive fighter jet falling directly toward them. On the other hand, their experience told them this was an air show, a place of joy and safety. Because of this bias, the crowd did not move. They didn't scream yet. They didn't run for the exits. They stood their ground. If you look at the photos from those final seconds, you see fathers holding their children up higher so they can get a better look at the low pass. You see teenagers with their cameras pressed to their eyes, trying to frame the perfect shot. They were looking at a death sentence, but they were framing it as a souvenir. This paralysis is what made Sknyliv so deadly. In a stadium or an airfield, the exit is often far away. Even if you realize you are in danger, the density of the crowd makes movement impossible. People were packed so tightly that even those who felt the primal urge to run were held in place by the weight of the people around them. They were a single, massive organism of disbelief, waiting for the plane to pull up, waiting for the miracle that the laws of physics were about to deny them. The sound of the engines at this point was no longer a roar. It was a physical force that vibrated in their chests, a warning from the machine itself that it had lost the fight against gravity. When the Su-27 finally made contact, it was not a single impact, but a series of high-energy disintegrations. The left wingtip was the first to go. It clipped a tree at the edge of the spectator zone, which acted like a tripwire. This slight contact was enough to snap the wing's angle, sending the jet into a violent cartwheeling roll. At this velocity, over 200 kilometers per hour, metal acts more like a liquid than a solid. The left wing shattered, and the internal fuel lines, pressurized at hundreds of pounds per square inch, burst. This is the science of the fireball. When jet fuel, specifically TS1 kerosene, is atomized into a fine mist and exposed to the white-hot heat of a jet turbine, it undergoes a rapid chemical reaction. It doesn't just burn, it expands. The resulting fireball was a wave of thermal energy that rolled over the crowd. But the fire was actually the secondary killer. The primary killer was kinetic energy. According to the formula for kinetic energy, 1/2 mass times velocity squared, the Su-27 was carrying millions of joules of energy. As the plane tumbled through the crowd, that energy had to be absorbed. It was absorbed by the Earth, by the parked Il-76 transport plane nearby, and most tragically, by the human beings in its path. The plane became a debris field in motion. The titanium skin of the Sukhoi is designed to be incredibly strong and light, but when it breaks, it creates edges that are sharper than any surgical scalpel. From a clinical, forensic perspective, The path of the aircraft was a swath of destruction nearly a kilometer long. The jet's heavy engines, the L-31F turbofans, continued to spin at thousands of revolutions per minute even as they tore away from the fuselage. They became unguided projectiles, weighing over 2 tons each, tumbling through the crowd like massive, flaming lawnmower blades. There was no defense against this. The physics of the event were so violent that for many, the end was instantaneous, a matter of milliseconds between life and the total mechanical destruction of the body. The meat grinder effect was caused by the plane's rotation. As it flipped, it dragged its jagged wings and stabilizers through the densest part of the crowd. It was a perfect, horrific intersection of human density and mechanical failure. When the movement finally stopped, and the last of the kinetic energy had been spent, the silence that followed was not the silence of a quiet afternoon. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a battlefield where the machine had finished its work, leaving behind a landscape of scorched earth and a legacy that would haunt the world of aviation forever. The transition from the roar of a jet turbine to the silence of a mass grave happens in a heartbeat. After the Su-27 stopped its violent cartwheel, the air at Sknyliv Airfield didn't return to the sounds of a summer day. It was replaced by a heavy, suffocating quiet, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of cooling metal and the low hiss of escaping hydraulic fluid. When the first rescuers stepped into the impact zone, they didn't find the chaotic scene they expected. Instead, they found a gallery of statues. The physical reality of the Sknyliv aftermath was a nightmare of frozen motion. Because the fireball had moved with such incredible speed and intensity, many of the victims were caught in the middle of a sentence or a gesture. Rescuers spoke of seeing people who appeared, at first glance, to be perfectly healthy and alive sitting upright or leaning against barricades. It was only when they got closer that they saw the cherry red tint of their skin, a clinical sign of carbon monoxide poisoning and the flash thermal signature of a fuel-air explosion. These people were victims of cyanosis, their bodies preserved in a grotesque mimicry of life by the very gases that had ended them. It was as if time itself had shattered, leaving behind a field of people who looked like they were simply waiting for the show to continue, while the world around them had turned to ash and jagged steel. The logistics of the cleanup were cold and methodical. There is no dignity in the recovery of a disaster of this scale. There is only the grim work of categorization. Soldiers and medics moved through the blacked grass, placing numbered markers next to discarded shoes, cameras that were still recording, and the fragments of lives that had been atomized by 16 tons of moving momentum. The air remained thick with the smell of scorched earth and the metallic scent of blood, a combination that sticks to the back of the throat and never truly leaves the memory. The rescuers worked in a state of shock, many of them refusing to speak, their eyes fixed on the ground as they tried to separate the machinery of the plane from the people who had come to see it. It was a silent, gray process of erasing the evidence of a massacre, a slow march toward an ending that no one wanted to admit was real. As the years passed, the tragedy at Sknyliv began to undergo a different kind of erasure. This is the stage of historical suppression, where the embarrassment of a nation leads to the quiet thinning of the records. The Ukrainian government moved quickly to purge the military command, and the pilots were locked away in prison cells, but the deeper questions were buried under layers of bureaucracy. In the official history books of global aviation, Sknyliv is often a footnote, a freak accident, or a pilot error rather than what it truly was, a systemic failure of leadership and a fatal display of national ego. We forget because it is easier than remembering the cost of our own arrogance. We choose to look away from the images of the field because they remind us that the machines we worship are just as fragile as the hands that build them. The records of the trial were sealed. The airfield was eventually returned to its mundane routines, and the names of the 77 victims began to fade from the public consciousness. History has a way of smoothing over the jagged edges of a tragedy until the surface is once again flat and unremarkable. We tell ourselves that it was a one-time failure, a unique alignment of bad luck and bad weather, so that we can continue to stand under the flight lines of the future without fear. But the archive does not forget. We look at the Su-27 and we see more than just a plane. We see the intersection of time, gravity, and the terrifying fragility of the human spirit. We see the moment where our desire to be seen as powerful overcame our duty to be safe. The legacy of Sknyliv isn't found in the medals or the memorials, but in the silence of the families who still wait for an apology that will never be loud enough. It is a reminder that in our race to touch the sun, we often forget how hard the ground really is. We are a species that builds monuments to our own power, only to watch them crumble into the dust of our own making. As the sun sets over the now quiet tarmac of Sknyliv, the ghosts of that July afternoon remain. They are in the wind that whistles through the hangar doors and in the cracks of the concrete where the fuel once pooled. We can try to erase the ink, but the paper still bears the indent of the pen. We can try to quiet the voices, but the air still carries the echo of the scream. In the end, we are all just spectators, standing on the edge of a runway, watching the horizon for a speck of silver that might never pull up. In the archive of the forgotten, the Sknyliv Air Show Disaster is written in soot and silence.